Greta Thunberg. Narcissist, empath, normal or narcissistic? Part 10. The conclusion. Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor. We have examined various facets of the life of activist Greta Thunberg to make a determination as to what she is. We have looked at evidence from a variety of sources over a sustained period of time, admittedly a shorter period of time than one usually would look at, given the fact that she is comparatively young, but nevertheless there is plenty of evidence to assist the making of a determination. There's quite clearly a variance of views from the comments, and much of it does also appear to be founded on whether people actually like her or not, as she is certainly a divisive individual, hero to many, despised by others. But we have been focusing on the evidence as opposed to any personal view as to whether Greta Thunberg is a good thing or a bad thing. After all, an empathic individual could be found to be insufferable. Narcissists often do carry out useful things, helpful things, whilst causing chaos and destruction in other arenas. It is never entirely straightforward. We have an individual who has no history of difficult relationships with friends or family. That is a significant pointer. Or is it the case that she's simply been very good at masking any fractious relationships so that the world has not heard about them? That might seem rather difficult for somebody who is so exposed. Surely someone would speak up if there were problems behind the scenes, as is often the case with problematic individuals. There have been repeated suggestions that her parents have put her up to her activism, but there is no actual evidence to support that, and indeed there's evidence to the contrary to suggest that it was she that became interested in activism and told them that they ought to make changes. She's an individual that has been in receipt of many awards, has rejected some, and has donated money to the causes that she believes in, often putting the cause ahead of herself. She has, however, engaged in repeated criminal activity, albeit tied to her activism. She is, whichever way you look at it, a committed activist, both climate and political, which suggests conviction and commitment. Or is it a vehicle for self-aggrandizement and attention, i.e. fuel? Is it someone who really does care about the various causes that she gets behind, or is she simply a self-absorbed individual that likes telling the world what it should be doing? We don't see any issues with regard to romantic relationships, but she is young and hasn't really had many. We've seen her get involved in numerous social media fights. Is she simply standing her ground, or revelling in winding people up and provoking them in order to generate chaos and controversy? We also have to take into account her diagnoses. Are they genuine, or have they simply been used in the way that a narcissist might use them to excuse behaviours and blame shift? Well, having considered the totality of the information that has been amassed from a variety of different sources, let us first consider whether Greta Thunberg would meet with the criteria for being an empath. The empath is distinguished by having an addiction to the narcissist, which they often find themselves fighting against throughout their life. They're governed by emotional thinking generated by this addiction. They have narcissistic and empathic traits, but their empathic traits are stronger, keeping those narcissistic traits in check, save for the presence of external stressors, of which there can be many. The individual has deep-seated emotional empathy, which is wide-ranging for a variety of different people. As I regularly emphasize, empaths are not saints. They're not blameless, and they're often flawed. But behind their actions is the presence of emotional empathy. They don't exhibit a pathological need for control, the receipt of fuel. They are authentic, rather than comprising of character traits taken from elsewhere. They don't exploit interpersonal relationships on a regular basis. They have emotional empathy rather than the absence of it. They aren't habitually arrogant or haughty, although such behaviours might be exhibited from time to time. They don't demonstrate a grandiose sense of self-importance or preoccupy with fantasies of success. But that doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to be a completely humble individual. Thunberg's commitment to the various causes that she has got behind would certainly give the appearance and suggest that she has extensive emotional empathy. After all, she cares about the climate, the environment, the people affected by it. She cares about the political circumstances of the individuals in Gaza in relation to the question about Palestine and humanitarian issues. And therefore, that would suggest that there is extensive emotional empathy for a wide range of people, and therefore the presence of strong empathic traits. However, she is particularly contentious and prescriptive with regard to the way that she behaves. She often assumes the mantle of a moral authority when one might question where does it actually come from. After all, she has no scientific qualifications. She does not have huge experience. It is simply her view, to which she is entitled, of course, but it is not founded on anything particularly substantial in relation to herself. The fact, however, that she is contentious and prescriptive doesn't necessarily preclude her being an empath. After all, see the recent analysis of J.K. Rowling. We do need to take into account her diagnoses, and in that regard, we need to consider, do they present as some kind of cover, an excuse-making machine that's utilised for blame shifting? Well, as I explained, the diagnoses have been provided by medical professionals in Sweden, and no evidence exists to suggest that those diagnoses are incorrect or fabricated in any way. It's also the case that when you watch the presentation of Thunberg in the way that she behaves and interacts, you can see that there is evidence of an individual that could well be autistic. To my mind, her activism and her behaviour surrounding that activism isn't actually driven by deep-seated emotional empathy, but rather a preoccupation with climate, the environment, and certain aspects of politics. And that obsession, that focus, arises as a consequence of her autism, causing her to hyper-focus on these issues. Furthermore, the confirmed diagnosis of obsessive-compulsive disorder heightens her anxiety with regard to these matters, causing further preoccupation and focus upon them. I do not see her behaviours coming from a place of deep-seated emotional empathy, largely as a consequence of the repeated contentious nature that she exhibits and the high-handed manner in which she tells the world how to behave, but particularly in relation to the confirmed diagnosis of autism. However, we have to keep in mind that whilst this precludes a finding of her being an empath, might it be that there is considerable self-interest, a need for fuel, a need for control, alongside the obsessive hyperfocus that is generated by her autism? Might it be that narcissistic personality disorder makes use of her autism to cause her to focus upon these issues and utilize them as a means to issue instructions, to be grandiose, to exploit people interpersonally, to show a lack of accountability, to use the autism, even though it's genuine, as an excuse not to be accountable, that she seeks fuel as a consequence of the repeated attention seeking? Whilst it's evident that she does not have the emotional empathy of an empath, is she devoid of emotional empathy as a whole? Let us next consider, might she be a narcissist? One aspect of narcissism is the fact that the individual exhibits a grandiose sense of self-importance. For instance, they are known for exaggerating their achievements, that they expect to be recognized as superior without any commensurate achievements. This is an accusation that could be levelled at Thunberg. However, there is no evidence to demonstrate that she has been known for exaggerating her achievements, that she tells lies about her qualifications. Indeed, she has been upfront about the fact that she doesn't carry any qualifications in relation to climate activism, but relies on the science and evidence from other sources. Some people will disagree with the choices that she makes, but she is going to some form of evidence rather than just plucking ideas out of thin air. It's also the case that the narcissist will often believe that they are special and can only be understood by or associate with other people of a high status. It's certainly the case that Thunberg has taken advantage of celebrity connections. Nevertheless, there doesn't appear to be any evidence that she seems to think that she's solely the preserve of high status and special people. After all, she began with her school strikes with pupils, that she has looked to encourage activism from ordinary individuals. There is a sense of entitlement associated with her, but I don't see that it reaches a threshold that would ordinarily be seen in relation to a narcissist. Rather, her high-handed pronouncements appear to be as a consequence of her inability to gauge the emotional responses of other people, that she doesn't quite get it as to how she should come across, as opposed to necessarily being driven by narcissism. Narcissists require fuel. She certainly does get a lot of attention, but it seems to me that the purpose of her gaining the attention is about the causes that she represents rather than necessarily her. It's been seen with regard to the awards and with other people that she's recognised their contribution rather than making it always about her. You compare it to other individuals that talk about themselves a lot. She talks about the causes. She talks about the evidence that she relies upon rather than talking about her. Undoubtedly, she attracts a lot of attention because the media is interested in her. And it became interested in her, of course, because she was a young girl that made the "How dare you" speech. And thereafter, she has continued to attract a lot of attention. But she is not somebody that exhibits a grandiose lifestyle. She's not known for showing exaggerated displays of wealth. She's not known for showing off. She simply wants to draw attention to the causes that she believes in. I don't see evidence of interpersonally exploitative behaviour by her. She certainly exploits causes for the purposes of ensuring that they're brought to the world's attention, but there are no accounts in relation to her relationships with family, friends, other activists that support that she is habitually and repeatedly an individual that is interpersonally exploitative. She shows accountability for her actions. She has repeatedly fallen foul of the law and has done so willingly. Whilst that might show an absence of accountability for failure to follow the law, the fact is she has remained accountable with regard to the causes that she supports, that she has taken her punishment and hasn't blamed other people for her shortcomings. She is not somebody that exhibits grandiosity with regard to her actions. It is the case that she can come across as haughty and dismissive, but I see that as more as a consequence of it being generated by her autism, rather than necessarily being inherent arrogance on her part. I don't see a range of manipulative behaviours on her part, nor issues in relation to boundary recognition, and nor do I see particular aspects of the narcissistic dynamic. She is not known, for instance, for love-bombing people. Indeed, she's rather bluff and blunt with them from the very beginning. She is not somebody that engages in devaluing behaviour. We haven't seen, for instance, the various aspects of the necessity of the assertion of control and a repeated response to threats to that assertion to control. Rather, when she fights back, it appears on the basis of conviction in the causes that she meets. It's also evident that there is the presence of emotional empathy in relation to Greta Thunberg, because this is evident in her dealings with her family and also with her friends. Accordingly, she doesn't meet the criteria to be found to be a narcissist, and I see the presence of emotional empathy in her dealings with friends and family. But it isn't the super caring that you might describe of the empathic individual. That is absent. Undoubtedly, she has both narcissistic and empathic traits, and we have seen that repeatedly with regard to her behaviours. Having discounted empath and narcissist, this then leaves us with narcissistic, but not a narcissist, and normal. It could certainly be argued that some of her behaviours are self-absorbed, but once again, that behaviour has to be seen through the lens of her diagnosis of autism and OCD. I simply don't regard her as selfish enough to be narcissistic, because whilst there are those that criticise her attention-seeking, it's often the case that they do so with regard to their own agenda. And what is consistent with regard to Thunberg is her message about the various causes that she repeatedly supports. She has demonstrated an absence of selfishness with regard to repeatedly talking about the cause, referring to the scientific evidence. The fact is that she has exhibited that she believes in. She has gained global attention for her climate activism, which started with her solo school strike in Sweden in 2018. Her speeches, such as the How Dare You address, are assertive, and they carry a tone of moral authority. It could be argued that this implies she believes she has a unique role in addressing a global crisis, which could indeed be seen as grandiose. However, her actions are rooted in a specific cause and supported by scientific consensus, suggesting that her stance is actually reflecting conviction rather than an exaggerated self-view. There's no public indication that Thunberg is preoccupied with personal fantasies of unlimited success or power. Her focus appears to be on collective action and systemic change rather than personal aggrandizement. Her lifestyle, which generally is rejecting fame-related perks like private jets and maintaining a relatively low-key personal presence, contradicts a fixation on personal brilliance or status. Thunberg has collaborated with scientists, activists and world leaders, but this seems driven by the necessity of her cause rather than a belief in her own specialness. She has not publicly expressed that only high-status individuals can understand her, that her interactions often include a broad range of people, including students and grassroots activists. She's received significant praise, but there's no evidence that she actively seeks it out. Her reluctance to engage with traditional media, for instance avoiding interviews beyond her scripted talks, and her focus on the climate message rather than personal accolades, suggests she doesn't require excessive admiration. Some might argue that her high-profile actions do invite admiration, but that seems to be more a byproduct of what she seeks to do rather than an actual goal. Thunberg does make bold demands. She calls for immediate action from world leaders, and that certainly is an entitled behaviour. But again, these demands align with those relevant scientists that call for action. And her tone reflects frustration with inaction rather than an expectation of special treatment for herself. There's no clear evidence that she expects personal favours or compliance with her personal desires, which distinguish her from narcissist. There's no documented evidence of her using others manipulative for personal gain. Her activism repeatedly involves collective efforts, and she has not been shown to exploit relationships for self-serving ends. Her decision to sail to Gaza in 2025, whilst politically contentious, was still motivated by a humanitarian goal, albeit a misguided one, rather than actual personal advantage. Again, you could make a case for it being performative, but as judged against other behaviours, it isn't sufficient of itself to get her over the line. Thunberg makes public statements emphasising concern for future generations and marginalised communities affected by climate change, which suggests an awareness of other people's needs. It's possible that she tends to overlook local complexities or the struggles of those she criticises, for instance, developing nations that are reliant on fossil fuels. And therefore, that could be seen that she lacks some emotional empathy in that regard. I see that the presentation of her behaviours and the things that she says is clearly affected by her autism rather than a clinical absence of empathy. There's no public information that demonstrates that Thunberg expresses envy or assumes others envy her. Her critiques of leaders and corporations focus on their actions and not on personal envy. Her direct and often confrontational style have been labelled arrogant by some, and particularly those that disagree with her views. Although those that support her would argue that her tone is passionate and urgent. Again, I think as a consequence of her autism, her delivery is affected that causes her to appear arrogant and haughty, but it's not driven by narcissism. Overall, I do not see that she meets the criteria to be found to be a narcissist. I find that there is the presence of emotional empathy in her dealings, particularly with friends and family. But it isn't at the level as one would expect in relation to that of the empath. Given the fact that we found that she isn't an empath and that she doesn't meet the criteria to be a narcissist based on the evidence, this then leaves us with narcissistic or normal. For a narcissistic individual, this person doesn't have a pathological need for control, but they're often self-absorbed. They have limited emotional empathy and are highly selfish. They are manipulative and often are aware of the fact that they are. It's certainly the case that she exhibits some self-absorbed behaviour, but I simply do not see her as having such low emotional empathy as would be present with a narcissistic individual. And moreover, she doesn't exhibit high levels of selfishness in terms of the collective action that she is engaged in, the fact that she has rejected awards, that she has afforded donations, that she regularly talks about the cause rather than making it all about her. Accordingly, I do not see that she passes the criteria to be narcissistic. She certainly has narcissistic traits, but I don't see them as numerous or as strong as they would have to be for her to be narcissistic. By deduction, this leaves us with normal. She does have emotional empathy. That is clear, but I see that it's only confined to a small group around her, family and friends. I believe that what would appear to some as emotional empathy for the world at large isn't actually driven by emotional empathy and is driven by her obsessiveness, which originates from her autism with regard to the cause of climate activism and, more recently, political activism. Rather than it be emotional empathy or a need for control and the receipt of fuel that drives her interest in activism, I see that this comes from her autism, which has been confirmed and diagnosed. And in the circumstances that she has both empathic and narcissistic traits, which can be seen in her behaviour. But the haughty, the arrogant, the abrasive aspects of her behaviour are as a consequence of the challenges that she experiences as a consequence of deficiencies with regard to the ability to read people, which is commonly found in respect of autism. That her rejection of certain individuals is again as a consequence of the autism and OCD. That her obsessiveness arises from the hyperfocus that is provided from this, which then translates into a degree of prescriptive behaviours and contentious interactions with people and social media. But there are sufficient instances of the presence of emotional empathy and various factors that demonstrate that neither total emotional empathy or narcissism are behind what drives her main behaviours. Accordingly, the conclusion in relation to Greta Thunberg is that she is a normal with conditions of autism and OCD, and that is what drives her behaviour. Once again, a comprehensive analysis of the evidence and what it tells us. These analyses do take considerable time to formulate the evidence, sift through it, consider it, and apply it. And therefore, if you're minded to show your gratitude by way of super thanks, my appreciation for doing so. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.